This lecture is about the connections between livestock, biodiversity and the environment. We've talked about a bit of this before when thinking about land degradation, but this lecture goes into a bit more depth, particularly about questions about biodiversity, an issue that's been raised again and again in wider debates around biodiversity and nature protection. As this map shows, rangelands, where pastoralists make their living, make up more than half the world's land surface, stretching from the Arctic tundra to the savannas of Africa, via the mountains and steppes of Europe, Asia, and Latin America. These are vitally important areas, but they're very poorly understood ecosystems, because these are predominantly grasslands mixed with trees, where millions of livestock and millions of people live, mostly in areas where crop production is simply not possible. So that's why we need to think about rangelands and livestock and biodiversity together to get a better sense of the story for policy. The rangelands I mentioned include savannas, mixed tree grasslands, tundra, steppes, parklands, and so on. They're all what William Bond and others call open ecosystems. Trees and grass are mixed in variegated patches. These are highly biodiverse areas and are maintained by a combination of grazing by herbivores and other forms of herbivory, termites and so on, and importantly, in many areas, fire. The other important thing about open ecosystems is that they're frequently not in equilibrium. They're not like a closed forest. They don't have a fixed, stable state at the end of a succession. They're always in flux. And this is important for understanding conservation and ecosystem protection. Across the pastoral rangelands, there are huge varieties, different uses of such rangelands. Here's a set of pictures from Gujarat in India, an important pastoral area where pastoralists making use of sheep and goats and buffalo and cattle and camels make use of rangelands in a highly adapted system, living with and from variability, often through mobile grazing and browsing. Rangelands, therefore, have co-evolved with pastoralism in these type of areas. Now, there's a great big push at the moment, quite correctly, because of the decline in global biodiversity over time, to focus on nature conservation and so-called ecosystem restoration. If you didn't know, it's the ecosystem restoration decade right now. A variety of different initiatives, many focused on areas that are deemed to be degraded and in need of restoration. But it rather depends on what we understand by degradation and restoration, a subject we've talked about before in this course. A number of different estimates have been made to think about targeting where areas should be focused on for these global attempts at ecosystem restoration. And by some estimates, over 1 billion hectares of rangelands have been targeted. And there's been a whole array of different initiatives, the Great Green Wall across the Sahelian region, protected areas in different ways, all trying to stabilize what are assumed to be degraded ecosystems. They're very much framed by an equilibrium idea of conservation. You have to protect, you have to control, you have to manage, and often through exclusion. But this forgets the fundamental dynamics of such ecosystems. As I said before, these sort of rangelands, these grasslands, interspersed with trees, are sustained by a mixture of grazing and fire. They're involved, the ecosystem processes involve a huge amount of carbon sequestration. Rangelands are often a massive store of carbon, and biodiversity is a very important part of rangeland ecosystems. But we also have to remember that people and livestock in these areas are central. living with and from variability, I've said before, and indeed in that process, conserving and restoring it. So what's the problem with some of these approaches to ecosystem restoration that are being proposed at the moment? The great paper by, again, William Bond and colleague called The Trouble with Trees, and a variety of other papers that are in the reading list that look at this huge enthusiasm currently for tree planting as a solution to biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse. But as we know, most planting projects, tree planting projects, focus on exotic and fast-growing trees. These are assumed to produce the most carbon in the shortest time and often sold on voluntary carbon markets as part of carbon deals. But fast-growing trees in the rangelands can become a big problem. Many pastoralists in East Africa and indeed Western Gujarat, where I had those photos from before, testify to the problems of the invasive shrub Prosopis juliflora, which was introduced as part of an ecosystem restoration program by aid projects in the past. So, planting trees, you have to plant the right trees in the right places, and these are not often in the vision of standard forestry planting in these ecosystems. Carbon forestry projects often require trees to be planted because carbon credits can be acquired against an assumed degraded baseline. The easiest approach is planting large plantations. These are easy to manage, carbon credits can quickly be calculated and cashed in. But as we know, plantations of trees or other crops exclude people, exclude livestock, exclude wildlife very often, and can seriously undermine plant biodiversity too. So the rush to net zero and this massive growth of carbon projects can be very dangerous and very undermining, not only of biodiversity and ecosystem conservation, but also land rights, food security, provoking issues of rural inequality and livelihood loss. But the rush planting of trees is unsuitable in environments and can lead to large losses of planted trees in many settings. Areas are cleared, carbon credits are calculated, and so-called avoided deforestation is claimed, but actually laying waste in the process to productive environments. So tree planting in grasslands is very often the focus for these restoration projects. As I mentioned, 1 billion hectares of rangelands has been identified. The maps in this slide show where ecosystem restoration is seen to be a priority. But if you look at the maps of Africa below, these are also areas which overlap with grassy biomes, with areas where there are ungulates and other vertebrates, and indeed where livestock reside. So there's a clash. Those who want to restore ecosystems are focusing on grasslands, focusing on areas where pastoralists live. Does this make sense? Well, the simple answer to that is no, because in tropical grassy biomes, the amount of trees in grasslands fluctuate over time. Trees exist in patches, increasing and decreasing because of rainfall patterns, fire, herbivory, and other factors. So it makes no sense whatsoever to impose a standardized regime of management on such a variegated landscape. Tree planting schemes from which people and animals are excluded can result in the massive buildup, as I mentioned later, of herbaceous material. Fires can become a real issue in such areas. And water cycles too can be disrupted by tree planting schemes. Fast-growing trees need a lot of water to grow and disrupt the water cycle within savanna and rangeland systems. So the landscape value of tree plantations, serried rows of exotic trees, can also undermine both the cultural, aesthetic, and wider value of a mixed biodiverse rangeland landscape. So there are some big troubles with trees. But trees are part of rangeland systems. They're important for browse, they're important for wider ecosystem protection. But we might need to think about where they're planted and how they're planted, rather than just thinking that half the world's land surface should be covered by trees as part of ecosystem restoration and rewilding projects. Of course, domestic livestock have been central to ecosystems, rangeland ecosystems, in combination with grazing wildlife, such as these pictures from savanna settings in Eastern Africa. But we often hear this argument that in order to rewild landscapes, we need to remove people and their animals and put back natural predators, allow trees to regrow, and allow to remove graziers in particular, to result in what is assumed to be a wild landscape. But what is wilderness? Wilderness is a construction. And as we said before, these ecosystems that are a mix of trees and grasses, open ecosystems that are non-equilibrial, are very much part and parcel of what pastoralists and livestock keepers, together with wild herbivores, have created over millennia. They are natural, they are wild. So the idea of wilderness, the creation of protected areas for a particular version of wilderness, is a very colonial vision of what the natural world should be, often imposed by those from outside who have a particular view of what a wild landscape should be. And this, of course, has moved its way into the conservation movement in the post-colonial era, in the advocacy of extending national parks, extending rewilded areas, such as contemporarily the 30 by 30 movement, the idea that 30% of the land's area, the global land area, should be protected national park, or indeed more radically, the half Earth movement, which says that half the world should be protected for wilderness, while the other half should be focused on human use and for intensified productive agriculture. So, to rewild or not, there's nothing wrong with encouraging a natural process of ecosystem restoration in consonance with livestock and people. But I think there are sometimes some very polarized visions of what rewilding is, because on one side, there's a vision of a rewilded landscape that is richer in biodiversity, generates alternative economic activities that are different to farming, such as tourism and so on, and is a more so-called natural forested landscape that can be recreated over time with the introduction of predators and others. So a so-called natural wild ecosystem is restored. But that radical vision of rewilding excludes people, and excludes farming, and excludes livestock production. So maybe there are alternative visions that can be more compatible with conservation, such as involving low-intensity mobile livestock systems as part of regenerated landscapes. Herbivore grazing, along with wild animals, is central to protecting these open ecosystems. As we said before, they are the product of such use. And a natural landscape is one with patches of grazing, patches of woodland maintained by fire and human use. And such land uses, as we've discussed in other lectures in this course, can be both important for biodiversity, but also for carbon sequestration, as well as providing people's livelihoods through low impact livestock production. While these pictures are from Savannah, Africa, this debate is relevant elsewhere. In the UK, for example, people argue that sheep are the worst enemies of a natural wild landscape and should be banished as they degrade the uplands and could cause barren landscapes. But sheep farming, of course, has been part of these landscapes for years, thousands of years indeed. And the open vistas, short grasslands, limited trees with grassland can be maintained by grazing, and indeed is a landscape that has embedded in English cultural and literary traditions, for example. As we'll come to in a bit, the reintroduction of animals as part of these rewilding efforts can produce some major conflicts with pastoral production. We've seen this in the consequences of the extension of the ranges of bears, of wolves, and other predators in pastoral areas in Europe. And this has caused not only much controversy, but also much hardship for livestock keepers. Rewilding isn't an easy, simple solution. It has to be thought about in relation to the ecosystems that we're thinking about, in relation to the livelihoods, the cultures, the landscape and aesthetic visions of these settings. And I think very often the polarized views that so often are pushed in policy debates can be challenged with a more integrated vision of regenerated landscapes. Very often, the particular gaze from outside, often a sort of European vision of what is a natural landscape, often centered on the idea that the natural endpoint of any ecosystem is a closed forested woodland, often results in the assumption that savanna areas, such as in this picture, are degraded, desertified wastelands, and they're not productive, biodiverse carbon stores that they should be if they only were part of a closed forest. As I've said several times before, this is a myth, a poor understanding of these ecosystems. And as we've discussed in other lectures, the assumptions about degradation and desertification have been widely challenged in pastoral settings. We need to understand much better how these ecosystems function, and importantly, the role of livestock and other herbivores in maintaining ecosystem health. A Western gaze, assuming that such areas with few trees are degraded and that a lack of grass in a drought period is a sign of desertification, that livestock inevitably are the cause of climate change and damaging biodiversity, has to be challenged. And indeed, there is a huge body of scientific literature, some of which is in the reference list for this lecture, that challenges these simplistic, wrong assumptions. But very often there are interventions pushed by international agencies, pushed by global efforts to improve the environment, planting trees, for example, that say that livestock and pastoral systems should be reduced, pastoralists should be settled, alternative livelihoods should be created, and areas should be fenced off and allocated for the preservation of nature as part of protected areas and national parks. This type of guns, wire, fencing approach to conservation has a long history, but as I'll argue in a bit, is deeply flawed in the context, particularly of rangeland and pastoral settings. Now, actually, livestock use of environments, of rangeland environments, whether the very arid settings, as in this picture from southern Tunisia, or the savanna areas of Eastern Africa, or the drylands of Western Kenya that we've seen in pictures in this talk so far, the use of such areas by livestock can actually enhance biodiversity. And there are 4 areas through which pastoral practices enhance biodiversity that I want to talk about. First is movement across landscapes, for example, through transhumance. This can assist in seed dispersal, promoting biodiversity and plant conservation. This is a picture of transhuman routes in Spain, for example, all of which have been shown to improve biocorridors, improve connections between fragmented landscapes in an increasingly industrialized and used landscape, and that this transhumance is essential for species conservation and landscape conservation more broadly. Movement allows the movement of seed in sheep's fleeces, for example, on hooves, but it also can allow the connection of different areas, improving biodiversity at that broader level. Next theme I want to mention is the idea that there are certain key resources within dryland landscapes or within rangeland landscapes that are vital for livestock and vital for other species. These are what we call key resources. They're often wetlands, for example, in drylands. They're often places where it's the last refuge for grazing at the end of the dry season. They're the places also that can be vital for migrant bird populations, for example, in the Sahel in West Africa. Huge migrant bird populations that come from Europe seasonally. They come and nest and feed and make use of wetlands in the Sahel. But increasingly, drainage, pesticide use, competition with agriculture can upset this interaction. Yet, pastoral use of these wetlands can be vital for maintaining these migrant bird populations and essential for wider global avian conservation. Just one example where the use of key resources by pastoralists can also be compatible and indeed enhance biodiversity conservation more broadly because of the synergies and interactions between different species use of the same environment. The third theme I want to talk about is that there are within ecosystems, often certain keystone species that are essential for ecosystem conservation. And they often live side by side with livestock. Here's an example: European vulture, highly endangered across Europe, but are reliant on scavenging dead livestock carrion for sustaining their populations. So the maintenance of vulture populations and pastoral sheep populations in particular are very, very much part and parcel of the same ecosystem dynamic. The last point I want to comment on is that pastoralist practices themselves increase biodiversity through indigenous forms of breeding. There is a variety of different genetic material that are sustained, exchanged, enhanced through livestock breeding, creating animal biodiversity across herds, across flocks, which are not only adapted behaviorally and physiologically to these environments, but also can have better resilience against disease threats and other challenges. So across these four themes, we see that actually pastoral practices, rather than reducing biodiversity, as is the case, as is assumed in the common narrative, they can actually enhance biodiversity. As I mentioned before, grazing can be absolutely essential for the removal of dry biomass and the suppression of hot and dangerous fires. In the Mediterranean region, in Europe, declining pastoral populations, though, have been associated with a highly damaging fires, increases in fires, and fires have been increasing in their density and intensity over the period of the last 20-odd years. And we can see from this map where this happens, again, overlapping with rangeland areas. And it's often because there are too few livestock, too little management, that these fires are causing more and more damage, including to property, to human life, and so on. Because as I said, rangeland, savanna systems, open ecosystems are maintained by fires, but not hot fires at particular times of year with huge amounts of biomass burning all at one time. These are so-called coal fires that allow the regeneration of a very diverse savanna biome. A number of recent studies have shown that those places that have been subjected to more dangerous fires with greater amounts of damage being caused, such as in Greece, for example, are areas where pastoral populations have declined over the last few years. They're also areas that were once grazed, once managed by pastoralists, are now forest plantations invested in exotic flammable trees such as eucalyptus and pine that have replaced communal grazing, adding to the fire problem across these areas. Pastoralism has declined in these areas, such as Greece, as in Italy, as in Spain, and other places in Europe and elsewhere, because of changes in labor regimes, a decline in availability of herding labor, but also affected by subsidy policies that focuses on intensive livestock production rather than supporting the ecosystem services that pastoralism, more mobile, more extensive forms of livestock production can offer. And the management of fire, and the management of water, the management of biodiversity that I mentioned already are all part and parcel of the type of ecosystem service support that pastoralists can offer. As I said, the responses to the challenges of conservation are often exclusionary: guns, fences, and so on. And this happens as a consequence of the push from rewilding, tree planting, the need to conserve, or the assumed need to conserve areas through protected parks and so on. Many millions of hectares are being affected by such so-called environmental policies, all in good faith, usually, aimed at improving the environment, protecting biodiversity, conserving nature. But they are affecting the lives and livelihoods of many people who are actually the real guardians of these landscapes, and whose form of traditional use these landscapes indeed are the benefit of. And as I've said through this talk, there are many aspects of pastoralist practice that are central to enhancing, supporting, maintaining, and contributing to environmental protection and biodiversity. Poorly understood, unfortunately, and the assumption is that all we have to do is get rid of the pastoralists, get rid of their livestock, and suddenly a fine, wild nature will re-emerge. And these distorted views are repeated in debates, for example, at the COP15 in Montreal in 2022, and the debates around the high-level commitment to the 30 by 30 target, which was agreed at that meeting. But where do the interactions between livelihoods and ecosystems fit in these debates? Exclusion is usually, if ever, the answer. You need to have pastoralists and pastoral peoples on your side. And this means creating a more collaborative, a more convivial form of conservation, as those supporting the idea of convivial conservation. Again, look at the video and look at the references in the session notes. This moves from protection to connection, a form of conviviality that allows for example, mixed use, integrated landscapes where livestock and wildlife coexist. Fences are brought down, that there are connections made across landscapes for more extensive use. Large migratory species can live with livestock, as well as managing disease in ways that are different to the standard exclusionary disease-free zone versions that are so often pushed. The idea of transfrontier parks or peace parks have been very much part and parcel of this discussion in various forms, particularly in Southern Africa. If we focus, as I mentioned before, on biocorridors linked to transhuman routes, we can get win-win solutions which allow for biodiversity protection and environmental enhancement outside protected areas. Such corridors are very much part and parcel of transhuman livestock systems, as we saw in that case from Spain, but also elsewhere. And we have to think about co-management and joint use of landscapes, including benefit sharing between conservation and livestock livelihood objectives. This is more than just creating a buffer area where people are allowed to use and then having the park somewhere else, the more valued landscape somewhere else. This is a genuine collaboration. And indeed is part of this process. Pastoralists, for example, can act as rangers, as protectors of these areas. They know and make use of livestock in different ways, and they know these habitats. And indeed, rather than being excluded, they can be partners within this process of biodiversity conservation. So I think by reframing our narratives around the relationships between livestock, particularly extensive mobile livestock managed by pastoralists, and biodiversity protection and environmental conservation more broadly, we can think of very different ways that protecting nature, enhancing our environment, and meeting the wider goals of biodiversity protection can be achieved in partnership with pastoralists. And I think we've got a whole bunch of materials associated with PASTRES, but also other materials written by many other people, ecologists and others, which is worth dipping into to get your heads around this debate. A first port of call will be the 6 briefing papers that we produced as an input into the debates around the biodiversity COP, but there are many other materials besides. And I hope this lecture provides a starting point for this exploration. Thank you very much.